Okay, so Dom, I'm still stuck in my house in the snow in the Hudson Valley of New York, but where are you? What is this all about?
I felt the need to do this, Jen. I feel like I need to get away a little bit. So I went to the near the Gulf of Mexico question mark. I don't know.
I was gonna know that's exactly what it is, and I am a trans supporter, but I will dead name that body of water to the end of time because that is the Gulf of Mexico.
There's a lot to talk about, Jenna.
Yeah, especially around that body of water. Anyway, let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. All right, so wild work here because whether or not you're sitting in front of the green screened Gulf of Mexico has actually become a very serious point of contention.
Oh, yeah, it really has. So this week, there seems to be a lot of bad blood between the White House and the Associated Press. And it's all over the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, right? I think we all know, like on January 20th, the president, one of his first executive orders he signed was about renaming the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America.
Yes, I
And so,
remember that.
and that change didn't become official until February 10th, when the U.S. Board on Geographic Names updated it in its records. So here's the deal. So, however, the name sort of applies with only within the United States. Other countries like Mexico and other countries don't have to
Every
recognize the
other
new name.
country around the world,
They don't have to recognize it.
yeah.
So now the AP, they've chosen to stick with Gulf of Mexico in their reporting, and they're saying it's because of the historical usage and the international recognition. Like their their articles, their news is goes worldwide. So
Yeah.
they're like, they're going to keep what they've been using for so many years. And they say, like, in response, the White House then, because of this, because the AP wasn't changing their wording, the White House barred AP reporters from covering presidential events, saying that that they're not using the name spreads lies. Uh,
Yeah, I
so
believe the new press
yeah,
secretary, Caroline Levitt, I think is her name. I'm sure I'll be very well acquainted with her name very soon. But specifically said if we feel there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, and she's referring to the press briefing room, we're
hmm
going to hold those lies accountable. And that's what really chilled my soul because so you can just determine whatever facts that are reported you don't like, that's a lie, and now you're going to bar that press outlet from the press briefing room or from any other official White House event.
yeah, I want to get in there. Like the AP executive editor, Julie Pace. So
Hmm.
she part of her statement that she put out there was limiting our access to the Oval Office based on the content of AP's speech not only severely impedes the public's access to independent news, it plainly violates the First Amendment, which obviously the the president's administration doesn't agree with. And it's like, I mean, to me, this is where it comes down to how do you not see that you saying how an organization, how this news organization is referring to the Gulf of Mexico, and because you don't like that, that you're saying, well, you're barred from all this. I mean, obviously, it's a free speech issue.
Yeah. No, I guess like I mean to me it's setting up such dangerous precedents. It's the only way I can describe it or compare it to is that movie. Obviously, everybody's seen Jurassic Park, but remember how like in the very first Jurassic Park, which came out way back in the 90s, that they talked about how the velociraptors kept testing the fences to
Hmm.
look for weaknesses. This is what that feels like. It's not that like this isn't the final goal. The Gulf of America doesn't feel like this is the ultimate purpose. It's to see how far we can push everyone to do what we want. Because once everyone accepts Gulf of America, we're going a step further. And once you accept that, we're going a step further. That's
It's
what this
always
feels like. And as a member of the press, and that's what is so chilling to me.
it's when you're able to start changing the words that are being used to report on stories, when you're able to intimidate, because obviously what message does this send to the other reporters who are there? It's
Oh,
either,
absolutely.
you have to fall in line or else you too, like they're making an example, but it's an example that the entire press has to now sort of deal with. And, people,
100%.
and
100%.
that's the dangerous part of this whole thing when you feel people are, um, there, it's just a very, uh, yeah, it's a very dangerous game. And I know that they mentioned over, but here's the deal. Like, I find that I can find as many quotes of other organizations, being criticizing what's happening here. Yet it's not going to make a difference to the administration. Like nobody cares, or it has nothing to do with being right or wrong. It has to do with just winning,
Well, no, that's what I'm saying is that I don't think this
steamrolling.
has anything to do with right or wrong, even the name. This is about testing the limits of like, I
Hmm.
mean, God, this is going to make me sound so conspiratorial, but population control and thought control. How much can we get you to accept our worldview, regardless of what it has to do with reality? And you start with the little things. Something that seems ridiculous and trivial, like Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America. No, you start there and you hold that line until everyone acquiesces to it.
Okay, Jenna. So now our next headline comes from comedian Hasan Minhaj's YouTube channel,
Mm.
where he sat down with Jelani Cobb, Dean of Columbia School,
Woo, woo,
Journalism School.
woo. Pew, pew, pew. Okay,
We love Jelani.
we do.
We used to have him on our show,
We did.
our old show. And they got together to tackle a big question, which is journalism cooked?
Mm.
And, and basically what they did is they discussed the TikTokification of news, something Hassan calls the hot take industrial complex, which is really interesting, and the
I
rise
mean,
of journalists as brands. So it's and then Hassan challenges the state of modern media while
yeah,
the Dean Cop kind of lays out what's at stake for the future of journalism.
everything. All right, so getting into first of all the TikTokification of news, which has been a slow-moving train wreck. I don't think we blame this all on the clock app, but it has been something that's been happening. So
Hmm.
basically, first, I also want to say that we don't want to violate rights, so we don't actually have the ability to use clips. So we're just going to discuss what happened in the episode, and of course, we'll include the link in the notes. Here we go. So anyway, the point is that Hassan, oh my God, I almost said Masan. I'm sorry. Dom,
Yeah.
we have to start over. I almost said
Okay.
Masan. That's
That's okay.
totally not his name.
It's okay. Take two.
Okay. All right. Oh, by the way, here's a quick question. Do
Yeah.
you think that I should include that like clarification that we're quoting them?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
How about this? I was going to say, how about saying, I'm going to be using some quotes. I'm going to quote directly from some of it, and some of it we're putting in context because it's a half-hour interview. We're not like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
To
I
do a
just,
little bit of
like we, didn't get the rights to use it and we're not just going to rip somebody else's content for our
exactly.
show. So some of it are quotes, some of it, we want to give as much context as possible, but the
There you
link is
go.
there. Watch the whole thing. Okay.
There you go. Perfect. Ready? Okay.
Yep, here we go. Three. Oh, wait, no, you counting because you're starting.
Yeah. Three, two, one. Okay, Jenna. So now our next headline comes from comedian Hassan Minaj's YouTube channel,
We love
where
Hassan.
we do, and where he sat down with Jelani Cobb, Dean of Columbia Journalism School,
Woo woo!
and they were tackling this
I'm a big
question
fan
of
of his work.
yes, and we used to have him on our old project that we used to work on together.
We did.
Um, and the big question they tackled was, is journalism cooked?
Mm.
And in that, they discuss the TikTokification of news. They also get into something that Hassan calls the hot take industrial complex, which was a new term I hadn't heard. I'm sure he made up,
Nope.
but it was really cool.
That's
And
a good
also
way
they
to
get into,
put it.
Yes, and then they get into the rise of journalists as personal brands. Hassan kind of is throughout the interview, he's kind of challenging the state of modern media today, and Dean Cobb kind of lays out what's at stake for the future of journalism. So, yeah, it's a really interesting discussion that they have there.
It is. And for the sake of this discussion, because we are responsible journalists, even though we are effectively laid off. So the point is that we did not take audio that we did not get the rights to use. So we're really just going to be like quoting here and, giving some context to what it was that the two of them were discussing. But the link will be in the show notes. So feel free to watch this. It's a fun half hour watch, right, Dom?
Half hour ship.
Yeah, half hour show. So it's totally worth watching. Anyway, so when it comes to the TikTokification of news, which I got to be honest, I love my clock app. I was heartbroken over the little debacle in January. But anyway, so Hassan starts out saying, okay, well, let's talk about where we are in time. Like, right, let's talk about this moment. And according to a Pew survey, it found that nearly half of all Americans are getting their news from social media. He thinks it's higher. I kind of agree with him.
Oh, yeah, totally.
But a third of adults under 30 are getting their news from TikTok. And so posing the question to Dean Cobb, does that scare you? And he's just like, well, I think it challenges me, which is, I think, an understatement.
Hmm.
So then Hassan's like, okay, so great, let's play. And they decide to play a game. And it's basically where they use the hashtag news and put that into TikTok's search section. If you know, you know. Anyway, and to see what it is that comes up when people are searching for news. And so they do that. They scroll through a couple of videos. You hear all kinds of pops and buzzes and whistles. And suddenly Hassan's like, that's it. I can't, like, get me out of here. This is too much. I can't do this anymore. And then he's like, honestly, I don't feel like I've been informed. I feel like I got attacked by birds, which again, like sometimes TikTok is
It
on
sometimes it
fire.
could do that. It can
Yeah.
do that to you sometimes.
And sometimes you're just like, no, no, let it cook, let it simmer a little bit longer. It's not ready yet.
Hmm.
So Dean Cobb comes back and he's just like, listen, I think that we've been on different kinds of things because he's saying that he got a lot of really good, well-produced segments there, which I always maintain that it all depends on your algorithm, and your algorithm rhythm is going to depend very heavily on what you tell the app you want to see. So if you're engaging in stuff that's like rage baiting, you're just going to keep seeing that because that's what the algorithm thinks that you like. Again, enough with my TED talk. So anyway, so back to Dean Cobb. He also says that some of the TikToks that he's also seeing are dispatches from traditional or legacy media organizations, which I've seen a lot of. You've got your CNNs, your ABCs, your NBCs, BBCs. They're all on C-SPAN I've seen on TikTok. So
Hmm.
everybody's on this platform. So then Hassan comes back and he's just like, yeah, but Dean Cobb, don't you think that the music and the graphics and the da 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 and and all the other stuff that again makes TikTok to me the joyous environment that it is, does that get in the way of the story? And Dean Cobb's just like, listen, I love this comeback. I've been on some sets for traditional news organizations where it felt like being locked inside a pinball machine.
It's
And
so true. It's so true.
it excuse me, so true. Um, because again, I don't think it's fair to completely blame TikTok
Hmm.
for this moment that we're in because this has been a slow moving train wreck, if you want to call it that. This has been in the works for a while where people's attention span, like people were doing more and more and more to grab your attention and to hold it and whatever. And if we got to have somebody on this little round table who's going to say something crazy and wild that's going to get everybody riled up and blah, 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 and we're going to breaking news, breaking it, like that's
Graphics, breaking news, reporters, cut-ins coming in. And you're right, when you do panels, like listen, having worked in cable news, it was something that you really had to be aware of that how much time you had. Like honestly, a 5 minute segment with one guest. Oh my God. It's like that's the longest amount of time. It had to keep popping. You had to always have infographics. You had to have cut it. There's so what clips are you showing? So it is like you are on like you are in a video game sometimes. Like they allude to that within the conversation. I'm like, that's exactly what it feels like. And you're right. I think the only difference with TikTok is how long it's very, I think I don't know how you feel, but I know for me, like when I'm on my phone, it's very different. It's more personal. Usually I have my headset on
oh, it's a very
and
intimate personal experience. That was one of
you
the things
keep,
that I tried to explain to some other people in traditional media that you what works on a traditional broadcast will not work in this space because people engage with it in a much more intimate, personal way.
So it can be a little bit more overwhelming if you have that kind of energy all the time. And I think it also depends on the individual. So my thing
Hmm.
is the whole purpose of it is sometimes honestly take a break. You just stop for a little bit, go do something, you come back, you look at things. I think when you try to take it all on one, if you go nonstop, it could drive you a bit batty, but that's up to the individual. Everybody, people have different ways of, different thresholds of what they can take.
Yeah, well, it's also kind of interesting because I mean, I admit, like, social media is one of the things that I'm checking in the morning. I'm usually going to my legacy news sites to see what they're
Hmm.
reporting, and then I'm cross-referencing that. I'm now on Blue Sky, and so I'll cross-reference that with the headlines that I'm seeing on Blue Sky, and what people are posting about that, or how other journalists are talking about what they're talking about. And then if I go to TikTok, it's really just to be like quasi entertained. Like I'm not
Hmm.
going there for news, but apparently people are. This is
And I think
fascinating.
it is. It is.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so speaking of people going to TikTok for news, that has created what Hasan has coined as the hot take industrial complex, which if he hasn't trademarked that, he probably should. Anyway, so he goes on to talk and he basically says, he has friends that work in journalism and, a lot of them say that the majority of the traffic, and again, we're talking about digital traffic, is for op-ed journalism. That's more than, like traditional reporting, which again, welcome to my TED Talk. There is reporting, there is analysis, and there is opinion. They're three different things. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Anyway, so Zahn goes on to say that he's asking basically, like, to Dean Cobb, do you find this concerning that there's sort of like, and again, Hassan's words, this Stephen A. Smithification of journalism a problem? And for anybody who doesn't know, Stephen A. Smith, he's a very, very famous like sports journalist, but a lot of his work is very much like screaming about, oh my God, blah,
Yes.
blah. Like he's
Yeah.
always like on 13 for every broadcast. It's a lot. It works in sports journalism, but when everybody takes that vibe and then applies that
A
to
lot.
everything, it's a lot. Now everything is a lot.
Yes.
So, hence, his hot take industrial complex. And, you know, he's just like when, for example, when he watches Stephen A. Smith's show, he's like, I know this guy's gonna tick me off. So then Dean Cobb's just like, listen, I would never publish anything the caliber of Stephen A. Smith's opinion in a paper. Again, the shade in this interview is just mwah. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so but he goes on to say that like the reason that you see so much opinion right now, and this part is really, really important.
Hmm.
It's because news budgets have gotten incredibly constrained. In fact, I'd say they've been gutted completely. And
Hmm.
so it's really not a surprise. Reporting is incredibly expensive, especially foreign reporting, especially investigative reporting. You have to fly people places, you have to give them housing, you have to provide all the stuff that goes on. Anyway, so there's a lot of expensive stuff that goes into producing one story. And so opinion is cheap, it's fast, it's plentiful. I mean, we
It
all
gets
know what
clicks.
Eminem said about opinions and body
Yes.
parts. Everybody's got one. So the point is that, people will click and read it.
Right.
So then Hassan comes back and he's just like, but people are conflating opinion with journalism, which again, I've been saying that that's a huge part of the problem for a long time. And he then like suggests like maybe if you put like the opinion journalism in like a different font, say Comic M Sans, which everybody knows is the font to not be taken seriously, and then regular News and New Times Roman. I don't know if that's the answer.
I, I hear what he's saying though, because I think the frustrating part is, you know, Dean Cobb does get into, well, that's how about, they should just be labeled opinion. And lots of places do that. The problem is, I think you start noticing more and more articles out there that are kind of it's not everybody understands that. People see sometimes the way, even with that, people will just see what they want to see sometimes. That happens to a lot of us. You get
Yeah.
hit with a lot of information out there. Sometimes it gets posted on another site, and that is omitted from when it is reposted, or when somebody reads from it on TikTok. All of a sudden now you think you're hearing a news article. Instead, what you're hearing is somebody's opinion. And that's where it gets really confusing. So, yes, that sounds great. This is opinion. But again, I think the problem is how it gets disseminated to the public sometimes isn't as clean as just going on, the Origin newspaper site, or the Origin news organization. It's really something now that, because it's being reposted and everything else, that information isn't always as easily known to the person reading it, and they don't always go back.
Well, one thing that I will say that I will give people grace on, and that is the way that people live and work. For example,
Hmm.
my parents were voracious newspaper readers. Yeah, I said that correctly. Anyway, so hence my chosen career of disaster.
Hmm.
But no, but like the fact that like my dad had a steady, reliable job that like when he was off. And so he had the time and the space and the bandwidth to sit down with like, oh my God, that man still loves his New York Times Sunday edition, but also like the Atlantic and the New Yorker, and to like have to sit down and like, thoroughly read and understand while you're sipping your coffee, whatever. And, I grew up middle class here. It's not like we were balling out or anything, but I've now had to explain to him on several occasions, dude, that was a luxury. The way most people live and work now, they just do not have the bandwidth
Hmm.
to take in a 5,000 word. I just, what, somebody's got to summarize it for me. What's the gist that I need to take away from this? Because I got 30,000 other things that I need to do, and nine of them needed to be done yesterday. Like that's most people's lives. So you have this environment that most people live in where they just don't have the time. And
Hmm.
yet you have reporting, amazing reporting that's being done that requires you to have time to understand it. Otherwise, you don't understand what's going on.
And I do want to say sometimes and this is not me dunking on TikTok or other social
You don't
media
want to dunk
sites.
on? That's what makes you a
No.
journalist now, Dom. You
Dunking, I just
gotta,
got to
yeah, you
dunk.
gotta dunk on somebody.
I know, but I see that, we've talked about this, how there
Yeah.
are some people on the site, on the platform, who will basically regurgitate information that they've read in another,
Oh,
news, and basically what they do is they make it something that's palatable to the listener, to the viewer. It looks produced. They get within a minute, they basically get the information they feel they need. The only problem is you miss the nuances sometimes. You don't get the full story. Like, even whether we were talking about, the story before about the AP and President Trump, the fight that's going on there. Like, you can have a discussion, but honestly, people really, the best thing is trying to go in and also read information too, so that you are as up to date. Now, I understand what you're saying too about the amount of time that people have, because we've all been there. And sometimes you get overwhelmed, but I think that's the thing. You kind of have to pick and choose the stories that you're really going to
yeah.
invest time in. It's not something you can do it for every story, because there's too much stuff going on.
Well, one of the things that I would love to see, if like again for the TikTok app, if anyone's listening, is if they can include a feature so that people who are like, re-reporting or rereading it, that you can include a link to the original reporting work. Like that would be, I think that would be so important and helpful. So that like, listen, this is my hot take or whatever,
Hmm.
but here's the link to the article. Read it for yourself. Now, sometimes people will say, like I'm linking to the article and like, the notes or the comments, or I'm still fuzzy on those details.
Some
But
people,
it would
yeah.
be nice if it was just on because most people engage with the video on the screen. They're not going to like a third place. So if there was a hyperlink that, but I know they don't
But
want you to leave the platform.
that's, I was just going to say they don't. And also, I don't know if everybody wants you to go leave I don't know if, I think some people do like knowing that people will come back to them to follow up on the story,
Oh, of course,
and
that's
not
how you get
necessarily
the
go.
clicks. But again, if people are going to this platform and create news influencers, I hate that term, news influencers for their information, then if that person is also giving them resources to the original reporting, then yeah,
Well, it
if this
should
is the
be.
person who you're almost like my TikTok news anchor, and so I'm going to go keep going back to you, or at least that's what I'm going to do,
Yeah.
because you're giving me your take, fine, but then also I know where if I want to read more about this or understand it better, boom, I can click the link and I
Hmm.
can read the story for myself.
Hmm.
And then also the journalist who actually read the piece, hopefully, if it's linking back to the, organization's website, that journalist hopefully gets some clout or something. I don't know. There's got to be a way to work that out so that the journalist who did the work isn't completely cut out.
Do you want to go on to the next story, Jenna?
Yeah, I know. Okay, sorry. I could literally go
Yeah.
on and on and on about that. All right. So, anyway, my other favorite topic, because I'm so challenged here, journalists as personal brands. And this was something that I immediately started bitching and whining about right after our layoff
Yep.
a year ago, which, no,
Yeah.
but seriously was basically
Yeah.
just like, uh, I
It's
never
still an
thought,
issue.
yeah, it's still an issue. Exactly. You can go back and listen to our earlier episode where I was complaining about that. But anyway, so when it comes to that subject, Hasan starts in talking about there used to be a time when you'd say, "Hey, I'm a writer for the New York Times," or "I'm a writer for the New Yorker," or one of these huge journalistic institutions. And now there's a growing incentive to say, oh, you're a writer? Well, what's your Substack? What's your social media following? What's your, all this other stuff about you? And the incentive structure seems to be, which is the point that Hasan is making, is more about likes and clicks and views and almost like clout chasing over being, just like a faceless person, part of a larger masthead, which is, again, the journalism world that I grew up watching as a child. So Dean Cobb is just like, all right, so one thing I think is it's not an ideal situation, stating the obvious here. Anyway, so but he understands why journalists have taken that kind of direction because in your career, if you start somewhere at 22 and you retire when you're 62, first of all, I think that part's already out the window.
Yes.
But
Yes.
but like it's not like when I grew up watching journalists, particularly broadcast journalists, but even like reading the newspapers and stuff, the bylines that I was seeing, the people whose voices I was hearing on the radio or the faces I was seeing on TV, they were there for some of them like 20, 30 years. They were part of the brand of whatever that news organization was. And so that was the world that I grew up
Yeah.
watching and
Yeah.
reading and listening to, and frankly thought that was the world I was walking into. Not this destabilized, like figure it out yourself kind of world where just like every man for himself, basically.
I
So
didn't.
yeah,
It's so funny because Chuck Scarborough, who I think, I don't, Chuck Scarborough,
not
he
personally,
just,
but
but no, but I mean, I
of
honestly,
him.
as a kid, I grew up watching Chuck,
Yeah.
and it was like he just left after 50 years in television. Like that is not going to happen anymore.
No,
You know,
there's
like
so many people we could name though who had been with, who literally were you just synonymous with
yeah.
that station's brand. That's not a thing anymore. And same thing with writers in some papers.
And so you kind of recognize that and you get that, I know Jelani goes on to say like this is kind of like an insurance card. So, right, that you don't, basically you can bounce for if people are working more and more like 3 to 5 years at a place and then moving on, you need something, a calling card for people to know who you are. So it is about creating your own brand.
I know, but I still am kind of bothered by the notion that if you're not popular enough, you're not good enough, which is
It's
really what social
Jenna.
media like
That's what
boils it
Jenna.
down to.
It's like, and I know Hassan gets back into it later on. He mentions something about that his concern is that this creates bad faith journalism because people
Yeah.
then are going in with this idea with, well, if I want to get more follows, if I want to get more likes, if I want to get more, I need to dunk on somebody. I need to make a splash. And
I need
we've
to
talked about
call
this.
so and so out. And listen,
Yes.
I'm don't get me wrong, the whole point is to speak truth to power. That is, at least to me, like the whole purpose of journalism is to hold the powerful accountable and to make sure that institutions are transparent. I get all of that. But it does incentivize, almost sometimes it can incentivize, not the worst character traits, but bad ones.
Yeah. And I think that's the part that can be so concerning is are you doing it the motive behind it? And I
Yeah.
know that, listen, we're speaking of idealistically, you know what I mean? It's a little bit kind of like,
Well,
oh,
no, I mean, again, I
but
admit to being guilty of the idealistic part of it because I spent most of my career in
yeah,
public media. And I mean, just speaking of, that part of it, there's a lot of amazing work that I've either seen other people do or I had the chance to do. And because that's not necessarily the mission, or not the mission, but the incentive behind public media to be like super click value or whatever, even though I feel like maybe the catch up is starting to happen now, um a lot of those stories didn't necessarily get that same kind of attention because they weren't like as in your face and oh my God, and check this out and so and we're gonna make them pay. And
yeah. Well, listen, having worked in, the private sector and, major, cable news and then working in public media, for me, there was it was so nice to work in a place where the concentration was on the work. Oh, stop laughing at me. I see you
I
later.
know it was so nice to work in a place like in my head I'm just like where I could breathe.
It wasn't, you know what though? It had its own stress. It had its own
Oh
levels of
yeah.
stress that are different. I know everybody could be
Yes.
like, oh, people thought about that, like, oh, that's so relaxed. That it's so like, oh, really? No
Now
budget.
it had a very different set of stressors, and
Yes.
yes.
So
But
yeah,
at the same time, yeah, when it came to at least the integrity of the work that was being
yeah,
done, that always
yeah,
felt like that was being held to the highest esteem. And
yeah,
again, in the world of clickbait, of brand building, of all that other stuff, is that necessarily the case?
yeah.
It doesn't always feel like that.
No. Anyway.
God, yeah. Well, anyway, it's a
Well,
really, really great show. And so
yeah.
we're definitely going to include the link in the show notes. So definitely go back and check it out. Well, kind of switching gears, I mean, building on it. So instead of focusing constantly on how the news is changing, which we usually do, we're going to pivot and bring you an interview about a moment that changed live news forever. So in 1972, the Olympics were in Munich and which of course is, a global sporting event, but it turned into a hostage crisis and it unfolded on live TV. And in the middle of it was ABC News's sports team, who, again, sports reporting is not about like usually breaking international news. In fact, it almost never is until it was. So suddenly the sports team found themselves covering a breaking news story that they never saw coming. And for 22 hours, their cameras stayed on, broadcasting this crisis in real time to the rest of the world. And it was one of the first times that people watched a tragedy unfold on live TV, and it changed the way breaking news was covered forever.
And Jenna, now that's the story of the heart of September 5. It's a film that is nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay this year. And today we're talking with the director, writer, and producer, Tim Fehlbaum, along with writer Moritz Binder, about how they brought this story to life. But first, we're going to show like a key moment in the film. It's when ABC Sports president, Rune Arledge, so he's played by Peter Sarsgaard, love him.
Mm-hmm.
He's addressing his production crew as ABC headquarters is pressuring the team, the ABC Sports team, who's covering the story. They're pressuring them to hand over the coverage to the news division. So let's take a look.
Okay, look, I know this isn't a responsibility that everyone wants, but does it make more sense to have a talking head from news take over from halfway across the world? Our job is to tell the stories of these individuals whose lives are at stake 100 yards away. And our job is really straightforward. We put the camera in the right place, and we follow the story as it unfolds in real time. News can tell us what it all meant after it's over, and I'm sure they're going to try. But this is our story, and we're keeping it.
Joining us now, Tim Fehlbaum, the director, writer, and producer of the film September 5, and Moritz Binder, also the writer of the film September 5. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations, of course, on the Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Really well deserved. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you
Thank you
for
very
having
much.
us.
Thanks for having us.
Um, you know, first question I think we really want to get into is, and I guess, Tim, this would go to you, is like, tell us why you decided to do a film about journalism. I mean, the journalists who worked at this time, and also why did you choose this time period to sort of tell that story?
Yeah, I mean, we found it. It's not that we said we want to do a film about journalism and then found that. It was rather the way that we were quite broadly researching on what happened on that day. And we more and more found out what we didn't know before, what an important role the media played. And this is something, an aspect that seemed very relevant from today's point of view, and also didn't seem to be too much explored by previous movies. And as we got deeper into research in that area, we had a conversation with Jeffrey Mason, that's the character in the movie played by John Magaro. And we were supposed to have like a 20-minute Zoom call or so, but like 2.5 hours later, we hung up. The producers, Moritz and I, we looked at each other and we said, like, did he just tell us our movie actually? Like, it was so interesting and seemed so relevant especially from today's point of view, like how as they as a group of sports broadcasters, that's also an important part of our premise, is that the fact that they were sports broadcasters that had to make that switch from reporting on the Olympics to reporting on this dramatic situation.
Well, I think, that's something that's what also drew me to it, is the idea of a story about the storytellers. And when it comes to that particular, I guess, time and time period, there's a lot that still wasn't known about, as you were saying, the impact. And so the other question that I'm very curious of is it's hard to not take what we know now and apply that to this time period. But what was the experience like of, I guess, trying to authentically recreate that newsroom, for lack of a better description, like that control room, that to authentically recreate that for that time period, because it's not necessarily the same now.
Yeah, that's true, Jenna. Thank you for asking that question, because that was quite a tough balance. Because of the knowledge we have now, like the knowledge on the conflict, the knowledge about media, the knowledge of or consequences that resulted after that day. So we really tried to get into the POV of those people in that room that day, to show that, because it's easily now, you can, like, in hindsight you always can judge, but it's we really tried to show them as people in that room who had like very narrow time windows to ask themselves very big questions, because it was something that was never done before, and they did it never before, because there was Peter Jennings, he was from news, but the rest of them were mainly sports journalists, so it was kind of a situation that they had never experienced before, and their knowledge wasn't very deep in that field. So when we found out, for example, that there was a conflict going on between Rowan Ardich and Peter Jennings on how to call the predator, like the perpetrators that day, what label is appropriate. And we were really relieved that there was like a discussion happening, because we didn't have to make it up, because we thought that's a very important aspect of that day. And it was interesting that the journalist who came from news, who was like a Middle East expert, said we can't use the word terrorists. And Rowan Ardich was like, but that's a catchy phrase, and to get like, that was like the challenge to get something in the narrative of that day that resonates with after, because there was just like small bits that they asked themselves that day while trying to make it happen.
And what to get to answer part of your question about the room itself, how we created that, it was really important for us that we stay as close as possible there to reality. And so we had, via Jeffrey Mason, that I witnessed, that I mentioned, we had access to the original blueprints, and we had a lot of photos. And the
Oh,
production designer
wow.
and his team, like they did big effort. They went to like a lot of TV studios to see what they still have in their cellars. There's passionate collectors of these items. Partly it's museum pieces, and on top, because the tricky thing was that on top of these things that we wanted them to be authentic from the time, we also wanted them to work so that the cast could actually interact with them, so that they would look at real images on the monitor wall with the real monitors from back then, and not just at a green screen, so that if Magara would push a button, that it would have an effect on the monitor wall. Because for us, we quite early said that our movie is also about technology, is almost like another character of the ensemble, because it is about how technology has an influence on the
Mm.
media, in that sense has an influence on how we perceive the world around us.
You know, Tim, that was part of what, for me, what was so fascinating. You know, I've worked in a control room
Yeah.
and I've been in those situations where there's breaking news happening, and to sort of see, you know, having the Chiron operator, you know, we have that to put the text on screen, having all the technology, you have a phoner come through, and, you know, that was easily done. But watching the film and seeing back in 1972, you have like phoner. We're like, how are we getting this on the air? Because they weren't in there. They weren't the, obviously the team working back then in 72 wasn't working in a fully functional control room that they had worked in before. So that itself was like, how are we doing this? And also, like you said, seeing how you put text on screen, having to actually put it on there, shoot it, put it on screen with the little letters, and then shoot it and then put it on and overlay it. Everything, it was so fascinating because I'm like, wow, I can't believe people were able to get this done the way that they got this done.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask, how, what do you hope? So now I'm somebody who's worked in that environment. Jenna's worked in that environment. What do you hope people who don't work in that environment, that they take away from watching this? Like, what is it that you hope that they sort of see from it when you were looking at that kind of stuff happening?
But I can start. I mean, for us, we always said like we are living in a time where the media landscape around us is so rapidly evolving.
Mm-hmm.
We might not even know yet what it means for how we perceive news
Mm-hmm.
and the world around us. It's also obvious, of course, that everything is becoming more and more entertainment, and while we don't even, yeah, might not know yet what that means, I think it's interesting, especially for today's audience, like today, where everybody can take a picture, be a reporter at any point, send it to a satellite at any point. It would be interesting to take a step back and see how a little bit more than 50 years ago, it was maybe the beginning of this new era of media coverage.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, though, I want to add that it is for us, as you said before, even though they are reporting on this tragedy, it is also a love letter or a tribute to that analog world of television making. And that's also what we want to give the audience, a feeling of the effort that it was still back then, and also a praising of the work they did.
You know, Tim, it's so interesting because you're pretty much touching on what is our wrap-up question for all of this. But Moritz, I want to go back to you and sort of also talking about the character development, because one of the things that struck me is that in reading about the film, some of the characters are composites. Even though this is a true story, some of them are composites. And one of the things that we've tried to really unpack for the public with our podcast is how many people, how many different
Mm-hmm.
jobs and positions go into. So, was it dealing with the true story? How important was it to not only communicate a character, but also the role of a position that you might have
Mm.
had to dump different people's experiences into to really just show that, like, but this person's position was to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's always the question when you write something that's based on true events, because you want the audience to really connect to a character, to feel like the time pressure or yeah, the decisions the character has to make. So you have to kind of condense the ensemble a little bit. So, for example, Jeffrey Mason, our main character in this ensemble, he's actually more like two persons back then, because he's the producer, but he's also calling the show. Back then, those were like two jobs. So we condensed that, and for example, the German translator in the movie, she's based on many characters, because or persons, back then there were translators provided by the Olympic Games. And that day, ABC grabbed, like we read on all the biographies, grabbed almost every German they could grab. I mean, even Rune Arlich's driver, who was like an old man, he had to get infos and do translations. So they were really desperately grabbing every German. And what we tried to do with Marianne and the character is to give her like the mindset of this young German generation that puts so high hopes in these Syrian games, because the whole movie is about the power of images, and they really try to achieve to send out a new image of a new liberal Germany, because this was 27 years after the war. So we really wanted to give this context like a face, and that was Marianne Gebhardt, which was very hard for Leonie Benisch to play, because she has to play a person, not a generation. So she did a tremendous job there by giving like this character a life, and yeah, but it's always hard to condense, even, I mean, talking about the 22 hours, condensing them into 90 minutes. So it's always about finding truthful moments in the research that have to go in there, and then try to build an arc towards them. And I think that was, with the characters and with the events, the case that we first tried to find everything out in research, to know everything, so we could condense it like properly.
Just to go a little bit off of what Jenna was talking about, the characters, because I became so invested in Jeff and Marvin, because I loved their relationship in the film. I actually went on YouTube and I found out they were still, like, they really were friends. And
Yes,
that I saw
yeah.
that I think Jeff had actually given the tribute to Marvin in
Yes.
2008 when he was inducted into this Sports Hall of Fame. And I'm like, I thought that was amazing, because I got that from the film. I got the relationship between them. And I also loved the scenes when anytime there was a really kind of like ethical moment that needed to be discussed, you had the three, leads within it, which were, of course, Rune, and Jeff and Marvin going out into the hallway and having those deep discussions of what do we do in this situation? We're like, okay, how do we refer to people? How are we referring to the situation? How are we deciding, do we run the footage? I know that was a big scene for me about whether or not, if we put the cameras and something happens, do we actually show what happens? Looking back then, how do you compare to today, those types of, what do you think? I mean, did you talk to other journalists today to sort of discuss how many of those discussions still happen versus back then?
Yeah, I think that was, we did a lot. And actually, it was the feedback that we mostly got is that for them, it was striking to see why technology obviously has changed. These bigger questions are still exactly the same every day. The question of the one that you just mentioned, censorship, like what do we show and what do we don't show, and who do we help with if we show something? The question of wording, what words do we use to describe a situation? And the question of the sources, like how many sources do we need before we go out with the news? And I think that's also why we responded so well to that angle, because even though it's such a long time ago, it's the same questions that are still relevant today.
Well, speaking of the questions that are relevant today, because one of the things that I think made that story, because I studied that actually when I learned this story when I was studying journalism in school, and the fact that initially getting frankly, the lives of the hostages incorrect, saying that they all made it when in fact they had all been murdered, getting that wrong. From your perspective, I guess, do you see this as the beginning of the unraveling of the public trust with journalism? That's something that we really try to explore in this podcast, because at this particular moment, particularly in America, trust is just terrible between the public and journalism. And yet mistakes happen. Like, having worked in the field, I understand, and I'm sure most other people can understand, mistakes can happen as long as they are corrected. Yet here we have an instance where, you could say that false hope might have been given to people by mistake in an attempt to get the story out first or early, etc. I guess, yes, your perspectives on this, but Moritz, I'll start with you and just get what do you think that urgency, that sense of like, no, we have to get it out now, does to one's ability to craft a story?
Yeah, I think that's the point, that if you're this one person, and obviously there were many persons involved in that decision, but we condense it like so that you can feel the pressure of that decision. We gave it to Jeffrey in our movie, to see, okay, you're there in this room for like what, 19 hours now, and the biggest news of that day is lying on your table, but you can't really confirm it, but it's kind of confirmed. And what do? I mean, you know that there are like other channels out there. You know that the German news already broke the news, so it's out there, and and that's the point. I think it's easy to blame like a person from hindsight, but it's such a complex situation, and I'm so happy that I've never been in that situation, because there's so much happening, because do you really get the full scope of the drama, or is it too abstract because you're in a dark room with just the monitors and windows to the outside world, so all you see is pictures, images, all you get is informations. Do you really get the full scope of the situation? So I think what happened there and what happened afterwards is that many newspapers or like outlets wrote about that decision, like not from ABC, but generally, I mean, everybody reported on it. There were like newspapers already printed and like sold in the streets. I think Jim McKay says it in his biography that when he went home, his wife still thought that they were all free and alive, because she read the newspapers in the hotel, and she didn't have ABC in the hotel. So and he had to break it to her that it's false news, that it was printed that night and before they knew. So I think it was I don't know if it was a start, because they wrote for weeks about it. Why did this happen? And they tried to find out, and they tried to find that one person who lied basically at the fence of the airport. But I think everybody involved was shattered how easily something like this can happen if the whole world wants it to end like this. So yeah, I think that was one moment in journalistic like history, journalism history, that made clear like kind of a Rubicon situation, or that happened, and what can we do that this won't happen again? And as we know, it happened again and again and again, because that's the world we are living in now. But I think it's not, the outrage of it was like put asleep, because now if you have like a fake news going around the world, there is not like everybody reporting about it for weeks. It's just, maybe that was wrong. So let's go to the next story. And that was different back then. Everybody was ashamed, and everybody thought, how could this happen to us?
Well, Dom, did you have another
No,
question?
no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Because we're coming up at the end of our time together, and Tim, because you have been alluding to the information and the technology that we have today, and so I'm wondering, from your perspective as a filmmaker, could you see a similar story taking place, being made about this particular moment? Because now what we have is a situation where, with the proliferation of social media, in some cases, newsrooms are playing catch up or confirmation or correction to what's been already around the world on Twitter or TikTok or whatever. Do you see that as almost like a mirror image, or like a balance of like, this is where it started, but here's where we are now, and it's just as difficult to manage?
Yes, in a way, absolutely. I think that was the idea of our movie, through that. I think historical movie, just as a futuristic movie, is then especially relevant or good if it says something about the present through that historical or futuristic lens. So that's absolutely what we try to do. I observe myself how my 24/7 thirst for the news cycle seems only to increase. How, of course, and of course, technology has an influence. It's interesting what you just said. and I think especially in these times, it is important to reflect on that, on our consumption of the media.
Just before, because I actually want to get this question in there, because I'm just so curious about it before we say goodbye. In your film, I got the sense that you didn't really use any kind of AI or any kind of technology in terms of, it felt very real in the moment. I don't know if you did or didn't, Tim, but I'm curious, like, how do you feel in terms of, in a film like this, how important it is to have that kind of realness to a film, as opposed to using certain technologies like AI in order to transport people to that time? Because there
Yeah,
are.
that's it. Yeah, no. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question, because, for example, also with the image, you try to imitate a look from back then, but you do it like we did shoot tests on 60 millimeter to see how that material would react in these circumstances. But the way we shot it was with this documentary style. We shot it with these long takes. So we could have never shot it. Even every director wants to shoot on film, but we could have never afforded that. So we looked at this this footage shot on film, and tried to imitate that look with the newest digital technology, like with a digital grain that the color timer has. At the same in the writing process already, like as Moritz said, we wanted always to stay stay as truthful as possible. But of course, at the end, we're still making a movie. We have to condense in the events. We have to combine characters so that the audience keeps engaged. So it's always that act of balance.
And when I can add one thing, what really was kind of the DNA of the project was the real footage of Tim McKay, because having access to that during the writing process already helped to see how he reacted, like in that moment, on those events, on those circumstances, and to not go over that, like emotionally or like dramatizing something. He was like kind of the bar the thing we want to hit. And I know that from the cast as well, that when they were in the control room and they saw the real Tim McKay, they knew, okay, this is the bar. We can't act more like more emotionally than him. This is the thing we're aiming for when it comes to being truthful and authentic. And that was really crucial to the project, to have access to this real material.
Well, guys, I gotta say it was a fascinating film to watch, especially to be able to, and Dom, like you said, the same experience where you compare it to your own real world experience in a control room, and just seeing the similarities that persist all these years later. The film is September 5. I want to thank both of our guests.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Tim Fehlbaum, thank you so much, director, writer, and producer, and of course, Moritz Binder, writer. Thank you, guys. This has been great.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Kemia. Music provided by Jay Cowett. Research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.